Hey everyone, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're diving into a really thrilling historical mystery. We're calling it The Text versus the Stones. We're going to compare what ancient written texts tell us about the Levantine kingdoms of Samaria and Judah with what the physical earth, the stones, the ruins, the actual artifacts dug out of the ground, what all of that actually reveals. We are heading deep into the roots of these ancient societies to try and separate legendary myth from architectural and, frankly, political reality. Imagine this for a second. What if the greatest, most massive, united empire of the ancient world left absolutely no physical trace behind? No way, right? I mean, you hear these epic tales of grandeur, but then when archaeologists grab their shovels and start digging, they find practically nothing. That is the ultimate puzzle we're unraveling today. It's a provocative question for sure, but it puts us at a true crossroads in how we understand ancient history. It forces us to choose between the stories we've been told and the hard, physical evidence we can actually touch. Okay, let's dive into this. Part 1, the missing empire in history. So we've got a massive contrast here. On one side, later written texts describe a sprawling, united empire in the 10th century BC. We're talking magnificent palaces, sweeping armies, absolute central rule, the whole shebang. But on the other side, the stones. In reality, when archaeologists dig into that 10th century layer, they only find small, isolated rural chiefdoms scattered across the Central Highlands. There is literally zero evidence of any central authority, no monumental architecture, and definitely no massive wealth that could support some sweeping, unified empire. And look, this isn't just some fringe theory or a wild guess. Top, world-renowned archaeologists like Israel Finkelstein and William Dever have reached a really solid consensus on this after decades of rigorous modern digging. Basically, there is a near-complete absence of state structure in the highlands during this time. The written history says one thing, but the dirt tells a totally different story. The archaeological record shows a complete administrative vacuum in the 10th century. The grand state simply wasn't there yet. Let's look at the real sequence of events. When you map out the timeline based firmly on the physical evidence and even contemporary Assyrian records, there's no synchronized, unified empire here at all. Actually, scratch that, it's more like a staggered evolution. Samaria emerged in the north as a major superpower in the 9th century BC. But Judah down in the south, it didn't emerge as a true institutionalized state until an entire century later, in the 8th century. They were operating on completely different timelines with entirely different trajectories. So that brings us to part 2, Rise of the Real Samaria. Enter the Kingdom of Samaria. Right around 880 BC, this brilliant military commander named King Omri deliberately chooses a highly strategic, elevated hill to build his regional capital. And Samaria wasn't just another sprawling settlement. It was the real deal. It was the first centralized political, military, and economic powerhouse in the Central Highlands. Under Omri, we finally see the true hallmarks of a mature, institutionalized state. This was where the real power resided, and it completely transformed the entire landscape of the region. Part 3. Samaria's alliances with Phoenicia and Aram. The Omride dynasty knew that true power required international connections, and honestly, they delivered a geopolitical masterclass. First, they moved their capital to dominate the super lucrative Jezreel Valley trade routes. And you know that famous religious drama about Princess Jezebel? Well, in reality, her marriage to Omri's son, Ahab, was a brilliant political stroke. It secured Samaria direct access to massive Phoenician maritime wealth. At the same time, they forged military alliances with the powerful kingdom of Aram Damascus to block Assyrian expansion. They were basically playing international 3D chess, and they were absolutely winning. And this brilliantly illustrates what I'm talking about. The physical proof of this strategic genius is just staggering. Archaeologists uncovered these incredibly intricate Phoenician and Aramean ivory carvings right in the royal palaces of Samaria. I mean, these aren't just random, isolated artifacts. They belong to a highly sophisticated Syro-Phoenician artistic tradition. This screams extreme wealth and cosmopolitan paste. It proves, beyond a shadow of a doubt, that Samaria was deeply plugged into a highly advanced global economic and cultural network. But here is the ultimate historical irony. The state that actually had all the wealth, the monumental palaces, the exquisite ivories, and the heavy-hitting international clout, Samaria, is precisely the one that gets marginalized and heavily villainized in texts written centuries later. It's kind of crazy, right? But it's a stark reminder of how later narratives, usually written by the people who survived, can completely obscure the physical, architectural truth of the past. The real powerhouse of the era just gets totally downplayed. All right, let's shift gears. Part 4, the late emergence of Judah.
A few thousand. That's it. To put that into perspective, while Samaria was this sprawling, wealthy powerhouse in the 9th century, Judah was practically nowhere to be found on the world stage. Jerusalem wasn't some glittering metropolis. It was essentially just a large, isolated highland village with a population of maybe a few thousand people. Geographically remote and economically quiet, it was just a tiny blip compared to its roaring neighbor to the north. Let's move to and see how this builds, because how did Judah suddenly step onto the main stage? Well, it was triggered by an absolute catastrophe. When the Assyrian Empire finally crushed Samaria in 721 BC, a massive wave of displaced refugees fled south. This forced migration caused a sudden, explosive population boom in Jerusalem. Driven by this unprecedented influx of people, and obviously some intense external pressure, Judah was forced to centralize. It finally evolved into a true state in the late 8th century BC. So Judah was essentially a classic late bloomer.
Which leads us to the final plot twist. Part 5, the shared Canaanite roots.
For the longest time, the dominant story was one of dramatic external conquest. Outsiders sweeping in to take over the land of Canaan and entirely replacing its inhabitants. But systematic digging has completely debunked that invasion myth. The real story? It's one of internal, local evolution. Indigenous, local agricultural communities didn't just vanish. They gradually grew, transformed, and organized themselves into these new political kingdoms. No one was wiped out. The people just evolved.
This summarizes the reality perfectly. There is zero material evidence of a sudden influx of new, distinct ethnic groups replacing the original inhabitants. The everyday tools, the pottery styles, the architectural footprints, it all proves an unbroken chain of human habitation. The people who built Samaria, and later the people who built up Judah, didn't come dropping in from somewhere else. They were already there.
So what does this all mean? Why does it matter? Because it firmly and definitively establishes their identity. Just look at the physical proof. They spoke a shared Canaanite dialect closely related to Phoenician. They used the exact same Phoenician Aramean alphabet. They built using local Syrian architectural styles, and they maintained the exact same ancient farming practices as their ancestors. Culturally, linguistically, archaeologically, the people of Samaria and Judah are a direct, uninterrupted continuation of the Canaanites.
Which brings us to our final, lingering question. When the stones reveal a completely different timeline, showing Samaria as the early dominant powerhouse, Judah as a later consequence of historical trauma, and both sharing the exact same local Canaanite roots, how do we reshape our understanding of the past? When the written text and the hard stones disagree, which history do you choose to learn? We really hope this journey reshaped your perspective and left you eager to dig deeper. Thanks for joining us on this explainer. We'll catch you next time.